You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The Nuremberg Laws were a set of discriminatory laws put into effect in Nazi Germany on September 15, 1935. These laws were introduced during a special session of the Reichstag at the annual Nuremberg rally of the Nazi Party. They consisted of two main laws. Firstly, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Germans, and also stopped German women under 45 from working in Jewish households. The second was the Reich Citizenship Law, stating that only people of German or related blood were considered citizens, leaving others without any citizenship rights and classifying them merely as subjects of the state. A further order on November 14th defined who was considered Jewish, and the Reich Citizenship Law officially started on this date. By November 26th, these laws were expanded to include Romani people and black individuals, labeling them, along with Jews, as enemies of the state. These laws didn't start being actively enforced until after the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, perhaps due to foreign policy worries. When Hitler gained power in 1933, his government swiftly began implementing anti-Semitic measures. This included a national boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1, 1933, and a law on April 7th that barred so-called non-Aryans from many professions. A nationwide book burning on May 10 targeted un-German books, including works by Jewish authors. Jews faced harassment, violence, and were systematically excluded from German society. The economic and social effects of the Nuremberg Laws on the Jewish community were devastating. Those found guilty of breaking the marriage laws were jailed and, upon release, often rearrested and sent to concentration camps. Social and commercial interactions between Jews and non-Jews dwindled, with many Jewish businesses shutting down due to loss of patronage. Jews were banned from working in many professions, forcing them into low-paid jobs. Leaving the country was difficult, as immigrants had to give up to 90% of their wealth. By 1938, it was nearly impossible for Jews to find refuge abroad. Plans for mass deportation, like the Madagascar Plan, failed, leading to the mass extermination of European Jews starting in mid-1941. Following the end of World War I, the Nazi Party emerged in Germany as a far-right political force. Their goals were clear: dismantle the Weimar Republic, denounce the Treaty of Versailles, aggressively oppose Judaism and Bolshevism, and establish a strong centralized government. They aimed to expand living space for Germanic people, build a racially unified community, and enforce racial purity by depriving Jewish people of their citizenship and rights. In 1924, while serving a prison sentence for the failed beer hall putsch, Adolf Hitler, with help from his deputy Rudolf Hess, wrote Mein Kampf. This book serves as both Hitler's autobiography and a detailed presentation of his ideology, especially his plans for reorganizing German society along racial lines. Hitler introduces the notion of Jewish Bolshevism in the book, a baseless theory that Jewish people were orchestrating a plot for global domination and were the archenemies of the Germans. Throughout his life, Hitler's beliefs, as described in Mein Kampf, remained unchanged. The Nazi Party's vision was to create a Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, to foster unity among Germans by emphasizing national unity and racial purity, excluding those considered outsiders or non-German. After the Nazis came to power, they dramatically intensified their discrimination against Jews. Within a month, the SA, which was the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, launched a series of attacks on Jewish businesses, places of worship, and legal professionals. On March 21, 1933, William W. Cohen, a former U.S. congressman, spoke to the Executive Advisory Committee of the Jewish War Veterans of the U.S., calling for a strong boycott of German goods. This plea led to a global boycott later that month, supported by many leading Jewish groups, though not all agreed, such as the Board of Deputies of British Jews. In reaction, Hitler announced a national boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1, 1933. By this time, calls for isolating Jews from German society were not only common among Nazi sympathizers. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, enacted on April 7, 1933, effectively removed non-Aryans from the legal and civil service professions. Following this, Jews were progressively stripped of their rights to work in other professions, keep positions at universities, and more. In 1934, the Nazi Party issued a pamphlet titled Warum Aryer Paragraph, or Why the Aryan Law, explaining the rationale behind these oppressive laws. Efforts to eliminate Jewish influence from cultural life also led to students from the National Socialist Student League purging libraries of books deemed un-German, culminating in a mass book burning on May 10th. The Nazi regime also applied violence and economic pressure, pushing Jews to leave Germany voluntarily. A July 1933 law revoked the citizenship of naturalized German Jews and laid the groundwork for deporting recent immigrants, especially those from Eastern Europe. Signs banning Jews from entering towns were commonplace, and Jewish businesses faced severe restrictions. During this period, other punitive laws were introduced. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, passed on July 14, 1933, mandated the compulsory sterilization of individuals with various hereditary diseases. Additionally, under the law against dangerous habitual criminals, enacted on November 24, 1933, repeat offenders were sterilized. This law also targeted so-called social misfits, including the chronically unemployed, prostitutes, beggars, alcoholics, homeless people, black individuals, and Romani people, branding them as gypsies and incarcerating many in prisons or Nazi concentration camps. In 1929, under the Weimar Republic, an office known as the Central Office for Combating Gypsies was established. Fast forward to December 1938, Heinrich Himmler, a top Nazi official, called for action to combat what he termed the Gypsy Plague. This time, the perspective shifted towards viewing the Romani people through a racial lens based on their Roma ancestry, moving away from earlier perceptions of them as simply antisocial elements in society. A pivotal figure in this transition was Robert Ritter, who led the Racial Hygiene and Population Department at the Ministry of Health. By 1942, Ritter developed a system to categorize individuals by their Romani heritage, even determining that someone with two Roma great-great-grandparents could be subject to anti-Roma laws. The Authority on Domestic Affairs at that time noted that the so-called gypsy problem couldn't just be solved by moving them around or confining them within Germany. A plan was drafted for a Reich gypsy law, which aimed to be a companion to the Nuremberg Laws, calling for the identification, registration, sterilization, and deportation of all Roma. In 1938, health officials were directed to register Roma and those with mixed Roma ancestry. Despite Heinrich Himmler's push for the Gypsy Law, hoping it would halt the mixing of blood and address his perceived issues with the presence of Roma in Germany, this particular law was never officially enacted. However, in a grim turn of events in December 1942, Himmler ordered the deportation of all Roma to Nazi concentration camps. SA members, frustrated by the failed Nazi promises to remove Jews from German society, were eager to take action against the Jewish community, showcasing their disappointment. An early 1935 Gestapo report noted that the lower ranks of the Nazi Party were starting to push for a homemade solution to the Jewish problem, which the government would have to acknowledge. After a brief period of reduced hostility in 1934, attacks, property damage, and boycotts against Jews surged in 1935, fueled by a government-endorsed propaganda push. While most people outside the Nazi Party stayed away from the boycotts and were mainly concerned for their safety amidst the violence, Israeli historian Otto Dov Kulka noted a split in attitudes. Longtime Nazi supporters and the general populace, even those not engaged in politics, seemed to lean toward harsher anti-Semitic laws by 1935, prompting a serious government response to the anti-Semitic movement. On July 25, Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick stated that a new law to stop Jews and non-Jews from marrying would soon be released, advising against issuing marriage licenses to such couples in the meantime. This proposed law would also prohibit marriages for individuals deemed to have inheritable diseases. Economics Minister and Reichsbank President Hjalmar Schacht, along with others, spoke out against the violent actions of longtime party members and the SA, noting their damaging effects on the economy and Germany's international reputation. As a result, Hitler ordered a halt to these individual actions against Jews on August 8, 1935, with Frick warning of legal action against those in the Nazi Party who defied this command. Hitler saw the urgent need for new anti-Semitic legislation to satisfy the radical factions within his party who kept pushing for the removal of Jews through violence. A ministerial conference convened on August 20, 1935, focused on this issue. Hitler argued against violence due to economic concerns and pushed for a legislative solution. The new laws would aim at preventing marriages between Jews and non-Jews to avoid racial defilement, stripping Jews of German citizenship, and preventing Jews from participating in the economy. At the 7th annual rally of the Nazi Party, which took place in Nuremberg from September 10 to 16, 1935, something unique happened. This event marked the only time the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, convened outside of its usual location in Berlin during the Nazi era. The idea was Adolf Hitler's, who saw it as the perfect moment to unveil long-planned anti-Jewish legislation. On September 12th, a leading Nazi doctor named Gerhard Wagner hinted at this in his speech, revealing that the government was about to introduce a law for the protection of German blood. Following this, on September 13th, Hitler called for the Reichstag to gather in Nuremberg on the rally's final day, September 15th. He discussed his intentions with Hans Pfundner, a high-ranking official in the Interior Ministry, and Wilhelm Stuckart, a legal expert, directing them to craft a law that would prohibit marriages and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews. These two quickly brought in additional help from the Interior Ministry, Franz Albrecht Medicus and Bernhard Losener, who arrived on September 14th to work on drafting the legislation urgently. That same night, Hitler also demanded they prepare a draft for a Reich citizenship law by the next morning. When reviewing the initial versions of the blood law, Hitler found them too forgiving and around midnight was presented with 4 new versions varying in the harshness of their penalties. He chose the most lenient option but left the definition of who was considered a Jew unclear. Hitler announced at the rally that these laws were an attempt to legally address a problem, hinting at a more drastic solution by the National Socialist Party. This approach failed. Interestingly, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, had the radio broadcast about the law's approval cut off unexpectedly and directed the German media to wait before covering them until it was clear how they would be implemented. On September 15, 1935, the Reichstag, with unanimous agreement, passed 2 significant laws known collectively as the Nuremberg Laws. The first of these, titled the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, set strict prohibitions on Jews. It made it illegal for Jews to marry or have extramarital relations with Germans, and also barred German women under the age of 45 from working in Jewish households. The second law, called the Reich Citizenship Law, was very clear in stating that only individuals of German or similar heritage could be considered full citizens of the Reich. Everyone else was relegated to a lesser status, essentially treated as second-class individuals without the full rights of citizenship. This law also contained a clause allowing for the removal of German citizenship from political dissenters or anyone deemed not sufficiently loyal or beneficial to the German state and people. Essentially, this was a method to legally disenfranchise Jews, Roma, and others seen as undesirable, stripping away their rights and citizenship. Following these initial laws, the German government did not stop. They enacted an additional 13 supplementary laws over the next few years, each further isolating and marginalizing Jewish people within Germany. Among the many restrictions these laws imposed, Jewish families were denied access to subsidies for having large families, and they were prohibited from doing business with Aryans, further cutting them off from the German economy and society. During discussions between the Interior Ministry and the Nazi Party, it was agreed that individuals with 3 or more Jewish grandparents would be considered Jewish. However, there was some debate about the status of people with 2 Jewish grandparents, known as Mischlinge of the first degree. The more extremist members of the Nazi Party wanted the laws to include both first and second-degree Mischlinge. This led to a delay in decision-making by Hitler, who didn't settle the matter until early November 1935. He eventually decided that individuals with 3 Jewish grandparents were Jewish, and those with 2 would only be considered Jewish if they practiced Judaism or had a Jewish spouse. This was officially defined in a supplementary decree on November 14th, with the Reich Citizenship Law also taking effect then. This law stripped Jews of German citizenship and their right to vote. Similar restrictions applied to Jews and Gypsies regarding voting in Reichstag elections or the 1938 Austrian Anschluss referendum. Additionally, civil servants exempted from the law for the restoration of the professional civil service due to their veteran status were also forced out of their jobs. On December 21st, a further decree mandated the firing of Jewish veterans from state-regulated professions, such as medicine and education. Although the idea proposed by Frick for a citizenship tribunal to prove Aryan purity for every German wasn't implemented, establishing one's racial lineage became essential in everyday life. Private companies were allowed to demand proof of Aryan ancestry for employment, requiring an Aryan certificate. One way to obtain this certificate was through an Ahnenpass, provided by showing that all 4 grandparents were of Aryan descent. This option was also available to citizens of other countries of German or related blood. Furthermore, under the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, dated September 15, 1935, strict regulations were put in place regarding marriage. Marriages between Jews and Germans, first-degree Mischlinge, and Germans, Jews and second-degree Mischlinge, and between two second-degree Mischlinge were all forbidden. First-degree Mischlinge could marry Jews, but they would then be classified as Jewish. A committee for the protection of German blood had to approve any marriage between half-Jews and Germans, though such approvals were rare. Later on November 26, 1935, this law was extended to include gypsies, Negroes, and their bastards. During the time leading up to and throughout World War II, individuals suspected of engaging in relationships with non-Aryans faced severe consequences under the law known as Rassenschande, or racial defilement. Regular courts tried these cases, but what's striking is that much of the evidence came from everyday people, neighbors, co-workers, and other informants. Those accused underwent public humiliation. They were made to walk through the streets wearing a placard that announced their so-called crime. Convicted individuals didn't just serve their prison terms. After their release, they were often rearrested by the Gestapo and sent concentration camps. Interestingly, because the law didn't initially allow for the death penalty in these cases, special courts were eventually set up to sentence some to death. Between the end of 1935 and 1940, there were 1,911 convictions for race defilement. As time went on, even non-sexual interactions, like a kiss or a hug, could lead to accusations of race defilement. The Nuremberg Laws, which significantly contributed to these situations, were largely accepted by the German population. This acceptance was due in part to Nazi propaganda, which convinced many that Jews were a distinct race. Challenging these laws or the regime could lead to dire consequences, including harassment or arrest by the Gestapo. Once these laws were in place, anti-Semitic violence diminished, leading to some public relief. Social interactions and business dealings with Jews dramatically decreased as non-Jews avoided associating with them or patronizing their businesses. Those who did face public shaming. While the Communist Party and some within the Catholic Church expressed opposition to these laws, their strict enforcement was somewhat delayed until after Berlin hosted the 1936 Summer Olympics, in part due to concerns about international reaction. An interesting statistic from the era was the estimated number of Mischlinge, or people with both Jewish and non-Jewish ancestry, which the Interior Ministry initially put at 750,000 in 1935, though post-war studies suggest a figure closer to 200,000. As Jews were increasingly excluded from society, they created their own social networks, education systems, and events. However, economically, Jewish businesses suffered greatly, many closing due to a lack of customers. This was a result of the Aryanization process, which transferred Jewish businesses to non-Jewish owners at significantly reduced prices, leaving many former business owners in dire financial straits. Emigration was a complex issue. Despite the Nazis' declared aim for Jews to leave the country, emigration was hindered by the fact that Jews had to forfeit up to 90% of their wealth as a tax if they wanted to leave. The Havara Agreement was an exception, allowing Jews to transfer some assets and move to Palestine, with about 52,000 making this move between 1933 and 1939. By the war's start in 1939, around 250,000 of Germany's 437,000 Jews had left for various countries. However, options for emigration were narrowing, and plans for mass deportations, like the Madagascar Plan, were infeasible. By mid-1941, the regime resorted to mass exterminations, leading to the Holocaust, which claimed the lives of an estimated 5.5 to 6 million Jews. Additionally, the Romani people suffered greatly, with death toll estimates ranging from 150,000 to 1.5 million during the Porajmos. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.